Welcome to the Radical Hope podcast. I am Anwalikwa Okonjo, founder of Ijerica, and in this podcast, we dive into the journeys of visionary leaders who are building purpose-driven careers, transforming their communities, and tackling some of the biggest challenges facing Africa and the world. My guest today is Crystal Simeoni, the founder and executive director of NAWI Africa, a collective that is transforming the way that we think about and approach macroeconomics and gender justice in Africa. When I think about what an Afro-visionary is, or who an Afro-visionary is, Crystal is someone that comes to mind immediately, and so is NAWI. NAWI is a truly disruptive, values-driven organization, and it has been a pleasure to follow their journey over the last couple of years. So I'm very excited to get into the details of what NAWI is, how it's gotten to the point that it's at right now, and also just share with you, give Crystal the opportunity to share with all of you her career story as well. Crystal, you want to introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Thank you so much for having me and having a conversation with me. My name is Crystal Simeoni. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm Kenyan. I'm sitting outside, so you can probably hear a few of the birds, which I think that's okay. And I founded and lead the work of the NAWI Collective. We started in 2020, just at the beginning of COVID, and so we're almost 5 years old now.
Amazing. And so before we get into the details of NAWI, let's just take a step back and talk about you and the starting point for your career journey. I know that you've had many different roles, but you haven't always lived in Nairobi where you do now. You previously lived in Europe and studied in Europe, but you made the decision to return to Africa, to return to Kenya. Can you talk about your background and what motivated that decision?
Yeah, so I studied in Finland for my first degree. It was very cold. My first winter was below 35 degrees. And then I did my master's in African studies in Sweden, which was really great. I learned so much. I went through a British system of education in Kenya, and so didn't have the opportunity to dig deep into my continent as much. And so the 1.5, 2 years that I was in Sweden, studying African studies really exposed me to a history, a contextual understanding of my continent. A bit of a shame that I had to go all the way to Sweden to do it. But I had then began to think of doing a PhD and was doing a research fellowship at the Nordic Africa Institute, and had a moment of clarity where I wondered if I really wanted to be studying my continent from a cubicle in Sweden with snow outside in a white nation, and decided no. So decided to go back home and figure out what to do and how to do it. And so that's exactly what I did. John Gisongo, who was then celebrated as Kenya's anti-corruption czar, was giving a lecture at the Nordic Africa Institute. Had a conversation with him, sent him my CV, said I'm coming back home. I just wanted a foot in the door. Ended up working for him, and so started my career off in a lot of governance work. Which was really amazing, and I think really grounded my politics as I entered into the workspace at home in Kenya.
Amazing. Can you talk a little bit more about, that starting point in governance? What were some of the things that you were learning? Are there any key lessons that stood out to you from that time period?
So I came back home, and all the theory on African studies that I had learned was really put to the test. And we were working on constitutional reform. It was at a time in Kenya where we were going into a new constitution, and really working with communities at local level to have conversations about what this new constitution means and meant then for their aspirations as Kenyans, for nation building of this country, and what it meant for justice questions, for identity questions, and all of those things. It really gave me an opportunity to have real conversations with people, everyday people, in spaces that I wouldn't necessarily have had access to, sitting in a cubicle in Sweden. We also worked on a reality show on leadership, which meant I traveled the country on a truck, doing road shows, getting people to submit their applications for this reality show on leadership. And it really took me to the beyond, the remotest places of this country, talking about leadership and giving me insights into how people think about leadership in my country. It was very clear that a lot of people know what they don't want, but questions around what they want, that's when things get a bit faulty. But also such a lack of women who spoke up, which was really interesting for me. And I think that's what began to plant some kernels of interest looking at feminist questions in a broader governance, but also economic governance framing.
What was the name of the reality show?
Uongozi. Uongozi means leadership. So the reality show was called Uongozi. The show, it was great, but the preparations and the auditions running up to the show was actually quite life-changing for me.
Was it difficult transitioning from Sweden and Finland, coming back to Nairobi? What was that experience like? And actually just resettling and getting into, local work. You mentioned moving from theory to practice, which I think is a very important transition that a lot of people, need to make. There's a role of, theory plays an important role, but, when you actually need to start putting it into practice, that's a whole different ball game. So can you talk about your personal experience with resettling at home in Kenya, and then, what that transition was like to actually turn your theory and all the things that you were learning into real world impact?
Yeah, so in terms of theory and versus real world, manifestations, Lena Some, another shout out. She's Kenyan, but she is a director of the Makerere Institute for Social Research in Uganda. She constantly talks about how the work that we do has to start in the concrete, in the real life, and then we can theorize it, and only then can it then go back into reality, into the concrete. And so that triangle of a trajectory always has to happen. And I rely a lot on her knowledge and her wisdom on that. And I saw it come to life. So that's a starting point, that everything that we research, all the theory that we work on has to be really rooted in real life experiences. And that's an ethos of a feminist theorization process as well. And so that was hard to take what I learned in a very white institution, in a classroom setting back home. And it really tested all the theories. I had to unlearn quite a number of things, re-articulate quite a number of things. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing that happened in a work setting is when I spoke to John Gisango in Sweden, and he described the organization that he had started called Enuka. I thought it was like an already set up organization. I didn't realize that it was pretty much a startup. And so I was one of 3 or 4 people. And so it meant my role changed with whatever meeting we were having. I went from intern to volunteer to head of digital to strategic officer. It was kind of all hands of deck, and we had to do a lot of shape shifting. And so it taught me the versatility and adaptability that is needed in the space and work that we are. I'd be filing one day and then speaking to a donor the next day. So that was interesting. It was also a little weird having to move back home after being away for a while and having my independence. And I mean, my parents are great, but there's always that raised eyebrow when you come a little bit too late. So that took a little bit of a while to get used to. But also socially, I was used to a different social setting. My adult formative years were not here. And so my friendship circles were those from high school. A lot of people had left and hadn't come back. But also even the ones that had stayed, I think, life moves in different ways and your experiences form you. And so it was a little hard to also reconnect with people. And finding new friends was a little bit difficult. Actually, I think to this day, most of my friends, even now, I've met through the work that I do. And so it's a true testament to this idea that the personal is political, and the work that I do is actually quite personal to me. And the people that I tend to have around me have a shared value base, have a shared worldview of what liberation looks like. And so, yes, we are in the trenches of the work that we do, but also downtime. It's who I find the most joy spending time with.
I really love that, because I feel like, I'm in London at the moment, and I think the general kind of way of thinking is that work is work and your colleagues are sort of over there. And I don't know if you've seen the show Severance, but there's a split between who you are at work and who you are in your personal life. And the two shall never meet. It's okay for you to be, working within a certain value system when you're in your professional capacity, and then, to have a different set of beliefs when you're in your personal life. And what you described is the exact opposite. Actually, because you are working in a context where the work that you do is so deeply aligned with your personal values and mission, I'm sure that it's not always perfect, and maybe you can speak to the times where there's tension, but you can actually build relationships with the people that you do this work with in a meaningful way. That means that you don't have to split your personality, split your value system, split your mind. And if we're thinking about, when I think about, again, just this concept of Afro-visionary and where the world is going and what it means to be building our future as people of African descent, do we want a model that is, splitting us in two, and that says professional is one thing, personal is another thing, and, those value systems don't have to have anything in common? Or do we want to be able to, in every domain of our lives, show up as whole and have that sort of integrity? Yeah, maybe you can speak to that a little bit more. Tensions.
I've been thinking a lot about community and relationship building a lot recently. And we had this wonderful meeting 2 weeks ago with some amazing African feminists from around the continent. And something that came up is this idea that neoliberalism and capitalism really puts you in silos and individualizes life. And that it needs for that to happen to be able to extract as much as it can. And I think resistance is saying no, actually. I think that relationships, community has to come first. It builds a thread of trust, and only then can you work together, especially if you're working together on things like justice, world making, all of these things that I work on. That has to be done in collective, in community. In collective and community means that you have to build trust with each other. There needs to be a sense of vulnerability with each other because we're building new worlds, and that can only be done in community. And so the way that we work with NAWI also, we're human beings and things will always come up. But I think it's also really special that we are friends, that I can call up people within the NAWI collective if something's happening to me, or just a simple, where do I get flower food, which is a question I got today from one of my sisters from the NAWI collective. And we're there for each other when we go through grief and loss, weird moments in the world, and the world is really quite weird right now, but we're there for each other, and it's a real sisterhood, and only then can the work happen in a real authentic way, I think. And so that in itself is a resistance to the system, and is a sort of, we've been going through this questioning of whether we use alternatives or realities because we're actually living in the reality of that resistance. But I think it's important to reclaim ourselves from that individual siloed approach to life and work.
Yeah. Do you think that that's natural to the fact that you are in Kenya? Is that the way that things operate normally? Or is that something that you've had to cultivate intentionally?
It's something that I personally have had to cultivate very, very intentionally. I grew up, Kenya is a very colonial. We were one of two settler colonies in Africa, Kenya and Zimbabwe. And so a lot of patterns of social formations, society, community were built on very colonial legacies. And so how you show up in the world, how you move through the world of work has been dictated to us. And this is the proper way of doing things. And it's something I've had to unlearn very intentionally. It's been very slow. But working with amazing women in my space, people like Hope Chikudu, who talks about building organizations with a soul, for example, and really pushes me to think about building workspaces, but building life in different ways and questioning all these things that we've been told are the only ways that things can happen, but also building with joy, I think is something that we've been so removed from.
Yeah.
And this idea that workspaces or the work that we do can be joyful at the same time. It's hard, but now there's a lot of laughter, which I love.
Amazing. And before I move on to the next question, for our listeners who may not know what these terms mean, you use the word neoliberalism and then capitalism. Can you explain what those things mean?
Yeah, and this is something that we're actually thinking about, and how do we build a lexicon? Because if I ask anybody around me what neoliberalism feels like, they know what it is. It's a privatization and it's an extraction of life, of labor, of time towards building economic growth, if you will. And the work that we do at NAWI is questioning that and also presenting alternative narratives for how we can organize our economies that are not so extractive of not just people's time, but also people's labor, and center questions of care, for example, how we caring for each other, mutual trust. And I think care for me is the biggest one in that. How are people feeling held? Can I go to a hospital and get treated? Is medicine only a reserve for the very rich? And how do we get off this treadmill of constant production and constant consumption is what capitalism presents as the only way for life to happen.
So, okay, so you've sort of brought us back to NAWI and the work that you're doing. So you're breaking new ground in many ways with the work that you're doing, bringing a macroeconomic lens to gender and working on financial interventions in the gender space. So what led you to this intersection and why is it so important?
Yeah, so my career has gone from a governance space into one that worked around inequalities and equalities. And so I managed a project that worked on health and education data and getting, the demand and working on both the demand and supply of data. So getting citizens to understand data that they could hold their governments at whatever level to account, and also getting governments to understand data so that they could plan better for their populations. It was really interesting, but the more I did the work, the more I realized we can have a great constitution and all the rights on paper, but if there's no financing and resourcing reaching people, then it doesn't really make a difference. People are worried about the actual materiality of life. And so I made a leap and joined the Tax Justice Network Africa that works on the fight against illicit financial flows. Africa loses over $90 billion every year through illicit financial flows, which is mostly multinationals finding ways to divert profit out of the country and avoiding taxes where they should be paying. Quick math, we get almost half, if not less than half of that in development finance and aid. So in essence, we can pay for a lot more of a development than we are able to. And so that began to strike something in me. And that experience also pushed me down a Pan-African thought. And I, thinking about how Africa as a continent has a shared history, but also has a shared destiny, and how we can work with each other in collective again. So there's a theme of collectivism, of community, to have some sense of liberation for our people. But working there, I always had a question of where the women were. And that was never answered. And so I figured maybe I'll try from a women's rights organization. So moved to Feminist, which is Africa's largest women's rights network. I started off working under Dina Musindarwezo. She is a fire advocacy feminist. And I learned so much from her. And it is at Feminist that I was able to bring together my analysis of the economy at a macro level and questioning how the world organizes economic governance, and bring in a feminist perspective and a feminist questioning of it. While at Feminist, though, I realized a lot of the work that we did was advocacy and policy influencing, but a lot of the knowledge that we used was many a time either global north, because they had the resources to do the intellectual work, and we'd use a lot of narratives that had been produced by international organizations, and as well-meaning and progressive they were, they may not necessarily have been contextually sound for an African feminist context. And so that's what began to sort of build as an area of curiosity in my mind, and decided to experiment and see what happens if we had a space for African feminists to question and do an analysis based on what they wanted to do, what they thought needed to be done, and from that present possible alternatives and possible different realities. And so started NAWI. That's how we came about.
Another sort of word meaning check, because we've actually been using feminism throughout this conversation, but haven't quite defined what feminism is and what African feminism is. And I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, and maybe people may not even know, like, how can feminism apply to macroeconomics? How does that make sense? So can you explain a little bit more what you understand feminism and African feminism to mean, and what its relationship is to macroeconomics, the topic of macro? You've already kind of touched on that a little bit.
Yeah. So Pan-Africanism in this context means recognizing the interconnectedness of economic exploitation. And we all know what that looks like from different African countries, from Zambia and their copper to Nigeria and their oil. And how does that intersect with gender oppression stemming from historical legacies, but also ongoing colonial legacies of extraction? So it's really about a couple of things. It's making sure that we're pushing for an economic sovereignty of Africa that centers African women and not just leaves us on the periphery of that equation. It means dismantling patriarchal structures that perpetuate inequality. And when I talk about patriarchal. I talk about the patriarchy that imagines women to be lesser, to not have space in the same way as men do, and also building solidarity amongst African women to drive change that is really rooted in shifting systems. So by this, I don't mean micro interventions that are really targeted at individuals to put a little extra money. So you can give me, and I've given this example before, you can give me a little bit of money to have a special project, but pushing for real change in the way our hospitals and healthcare systems are run, our education systems, and how are those systems working for women? And then also lastly, centering African women's agency in all aspects of this in a meaningful way. And by this, I don't mean just representation. Representation is one step, but we have to go beyond that towards meaningful representation. So there's a difference between just having a woman in a position of power versus having a feminist in a position of power. They think about different things. So when I talk about feminism, for me, my feminism centers an analysis of power. So it's not just about the genders, but it's really looking at who's at the center, who's calling the shots, and who has been left behind in terms of ability to influence what an agenda is, what a framework is, what do our budgets look like, what do our taxation systems look like, and who's making those decisions. Is it been made by the World Bank in DC, an all-white male panel? Is it been made in Kenya by, again, all men making decisions about women's bodies and how they access healthcare and maternity care and all of those things? So those are how, in my head, all of those intersect and interplay.
I think that was a really helpful explanation. I was really shocked to hear that, $90 billion is leaving the continent, and yet we're having, conversations about aid. Obviously, with what's happened recently with the shutdown of US aid, there's a lot of uproar about, the knock-on effects that will have and the real consequences. But there's also a parallel conversation about dependency and about the fact that this aid structure has for a long time been criticized as being not only insufficient, but actually harmful in many ways to, to people of African descent, to the African continent. And as you just said, $90 billion is leaving, and we're getting maybe half of that in aid. We could actually fund our own development. So can you talk a little bit more about given the structural and economic disparities between African countries, what does meaningful Pan-African solidarity look like? And what does it look like to reclaim agency and ownership over our development?
Yes, I think we also have to think about culture, and a lot of players in the justice space on economic justice kind of forget the power of culture. And by culture, I mean music, the arts, all the work that's creative that shapes social discourse, imaginations, dreaming, all of those things. The US has done this exceptionally well. They use Hollywood, they use their music to have a sort of cultural domination over us and paint this imagination of this great American country, land of the free, home of the brave, whatever they say. And we forget that, right? I think, like you said, narratives are really important. Of the over 90, I think it's at $96 billion that we lose, only 5% of that is through corruption. And yet this continent is painted as the bastion of corruption. If you look at the corruption index, the global South, Africa, probably number one, is all red. Like, we are the most corrupt. But if you look at the secrecy index, and this is the money that all of this illicit financial flows ends up in jurisdictions with very low transparency, very low tax rates, so it's sort of Ireland, Jersey, Mauritius, those kinds of countries. The countries with the most money in those jurisdictions are actually in the global South. We don't call it corruption, we don't call it theft, but it's bleeding this continent of so much in terms of resources. So out of the 96 billion, 5% of that is through corruption. 65% is through multinational activity. So it's the big multinationals, the big companies that are operating in our jurisdiction, but finding loopholes in our policy and legislation spaces to move money out of this continent instead of paying the taxes, their fair share of taxes. Nobody's saying don't make a profit. What we're saying is make a profit, but pay your fair share of taxes in the countries that you're operating in to be able to pay for the development of the country that you're situated in. So that's the first. Secondly, the way that aid has been used is a sort of, in my head, a soft power approach to diplomacy. USAID as a gift from the American people, and what that means for African citizenry and identity and sense of worth. I think there's something to be analyzed there. There's an impact of our education system. And I think in the 80s and 90s, big international financial institutions poured a lot of money in our education systems, and especially economic education systems. And so there's a skewing of ideological economic framing that has happened that is all privatization, the state, pulling back the role of the government and presenting forth that private sector and private finance will save us all from everything. But that as a model in and of itself has been based on what they call a rational man, which you wonder how you create an economy with assumptions around a rational man who is probably a white, cis, heterosexual man. So what happens when you're trying to build economies for queer, Black, African communities? There's questions there. But then I think we can't have this conversation without talking about reparations and all the resources that left this continent but continues to be extracted from this continent. And a reparation doesn't mean just a monetary return. It also alludes to a cessation of the extraction, but also a change in the system. So even if you did stop or give a monetary return, the system in and of itself has to change so that this is non-repetitive. And this is the African Union's year. The theme of this year is reparations, and it's something that we have to talk about. When I think about aid, I don't think of it as a gift. I think of it as a reparation, but it has to be a reparation based on our terms, which I think hasn't been happening. And the narrative around aid has been skewed as if it's something that we should be grateful for, that we should beg for. And I think coming to it with a different mentality is important, and shifting it from just service delivery into more funding, a change in the system and reforming the system that governs our economies is something that really needs to be spoken about.
Yeah. There are a few things that you mentioned there that I just want to, really highlight. One, the role of narratives and education, that, a lot of the ways that we see things operating is the ways that we think about the economy, think about how, our financial systems work, our relationships between different countries work. We see these things as normal, and we don't see the sort of invisible, or maybe they're not that invisible, the underlying
Insidious.
the insidious efforts to shape the way that we think about these things, and to do so through education. I mean, Ijerica obviously being an education and knowledge sharing community, this is very important that we highlight that there are alternatives that are viable, and just because they are not presented in the mainstream does not mean that they're not viable. And so it's not to say that anyone has 100% the right answers, but to seriously consider alternatives. So the point about reparations and it not being a charitable act, but something that is actually owed to us. And you're right, it is very important and very notable that this year is the year of reparations. And we're having these conversations seriously. The African Union is having these conversations. It's driving these conversations. Reparations is something that we talked about within the Ijerica community. And not only to have those conversations, but for it to be on our terms. And I think a lot of the time, there's this sense of, like, for example, when it comes to the repatriation of art back to the continent, there's this sense of like, oh, well, will you guys be able to, keep it safe, and will you take care of it, and things like that. This very patronizing view. And I think it's the same when it comes to, our finances and to money and to wealth, that can we be responsible? But as you mentioned, the corruption index may say that Africa is the most corrupt continent, but I think it's really important that you highlighted that the secrecy index is showing us something as well, that a lot of the secrecy is sort of concentrated within the global north, and we have to question these dynamics. So I really appreciate you bringing this up. So one thing I didn't hear you speak to, though, is what does how does Pan-African solidarity come into play in terms of a starting point for addressing these issues? Can it be addressed on a country by country basis or a region by region basis, or do we need to have a Pan-African perspective on these challenges?
So I recognize that our African countries have such different historical colonial legacies, and different colonial powers colonized very differently. The Belgians colonized differently from the English, from the French. And so what is manifesting is very different. For example, in Francophone West Africa, there their currency tied to the French treasury dictate their struggle in a very different formulation. Hope is a big thing that, we're now, at least I'm trying to hold on to. But we have the African Union. Now it's messy and it's not perfect, but it's something. And giving the example of the illicit financial flows, world and space, and fight for justice, the African Union had what they call the high-level panel on illicit financial flows, chaired by Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa. And they came up with a report that defined the issue and came up with what we needed to do to battle it. And from this document is what everybody works from. Civil society, governments, we all have one voice, one demand, one ask. And it's a stronger ask because we can all over 50 countries of us can rally behind this. When I have conversations with colleagues in Asia and Latin America, they don't have a pan-Asian or a pan-Latin American identity, community, organization to rally behind. And so asking for justice from a global economic order becomes that much harder. They don't have a space where they can come together to battle it out a little bit, but then come up with a common agenda. And Africa does that with many difficulties, but does that quite well. And so I'm actually quite privileged to be African because we have that. And we also have very many organizations that are pan-African in identity. And this gives us a common voice, but it also brings together this idea that we can collectively exist. I have been questioning quite a bit the idea of nation building based on what a nation is. It's such a colonial construct. We have communities like the Teso in the west of Kenya that have family members on either side of the border between Uganda and Kenya. So what does that mean? And for me, a Pan-African aspiration makes more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we might even have to have a different guest on to even just get into the weeds of the way that we think about the nation states and things like that, because that's a really important conversation to have. Okay, so we talked about the challenges, we've talked about the problems, but I'm going to talk about possibilities. And I want to ask you the question, if you had unlimited resources and influence, what's one structural change that you would prioritize for African economies?
Just one. I would, first of all, I'd have everyone undergo like some feminist, you know how in Men in Black, which is a very old movie, they would zap your brain to, like, I would zap them.
People against us feminists, they'll say that they're trying to brain.
I'm okay with it. They brainwash us all the time through our TV, our music, all of that stuff.
Very cool.
But no, on a serious note, I would really center care in all our policies. With examples of like Latin America, the city of Bogota in Colombia, they have care centers in the city. So everything is within 5 minutes, your school, your hospitals, your care centers. So what does policy making look like if you center care in agricultural policies? If you center care in education policies and finance policies, I think that would wildly change the direction. And then secondly, if I took out economic growth as a point in the horizon that all our economies and societies and countries are working towards, I wonder what changes would happen. So those, I think, would be my first two things. Take away the idea that we're working towards economic growth and center care at the center, and let's see what happens.
Amazing. Yes, I absolutely love that. How do we move beyond, and I know this is a very difficult and nuanced question, so it's okay if there's not a, sort of final answer, but how do you think that we move beyond rhetoric and, fully ensure that our economic framework serve African people rather than external interests?
For us at NAWI, I can't speak for everyone, but for us at NAWI, when we try and think about this question, we say that we center everything that we do, all our analysis, all our work on an African working woman. An African working woman is our historical subject. That's who we take into analysis, both theoretical, academic analysis, but also creative manifestations of this analysis. It gives us the breadth of an African woman as well, from a sex worker to a peasant worker, peasant farmer, to a CEO at a bank, to a nail technician. It's the breadth of it. Taxation, debt will affect women, all these women, in a very personal way. It might manifest a little bit differently, but affect them, it will. So that's how we try and shift from just rhetoric to actual work that begins to touch people's lives. And this, we're driven by, the feminist idea that the personal is political. So if we can't bring ourselves and our problems and our experiences of the economy into the center, then whose economy are we working to build? And I think that's where we have to start.
Yeah, love that. So having a clear person or archetype that you're working toward, that you're serving, and knowing who that person is and always centering that, I think is a really, really helpful lesson for a lot of people. One of the things that I really loved in speaking to you and in our pre-interview was that you said that how you do the work is just as important as the content, what you produce. You've already, sort of highlighted that in many different ways. But can you just sort of expound on what are some examples of how NAWI embodies this philosophy in the structure of its organization and the work that you do and the creativity in which you address the challenges that you've chosen to commit yourselves to?
Yeah, I think so. Jessica Horn's book just came out on African feminist praxis, and now he's featured in chapter 8. I think it's chapter 8 on
Amazing. The book
pleasure.
arrived for me today, actually, so I was very excited.
Yeah, yeah, and her book has been really great. And talking about highlighting the work of African feminists and women, it's an ode to that. So we're in chapter 8, which is on pleasure, which I think is in itself a way of resistance. We work on economic questions at a macro level, which a lot of people think is a very boring issue. The most you can have in terms of color is maybe black, white, maybe blue if you're really out there. But creativity and art and beauty is something that is central to the work of NAWI. And that's what she writes about. And I think that in itself is defiant of the status quo of economic resistance in itself. It's a domain that has been largely been held by masculine energy and men, even on the continent. And so us being in that space with my orange glasses is also resistance. The work that we do oscillating between technical analysis that can be published in academic journals and those kinds of spaces at the same time as having creative outputs is also as important for us. We like to speak of economic analysis in the language of life rather than say that we're simplifying things. So that's also something different. And the way that we organize as well, we don't organize as a typical organization. We have a center, which we call the mothership, that scaffolds the work that we do, takes care of administration and finance and reporting to donors. And then we have a team of 11 associates who carry the work and really hold the vision of NAWI and what areas of work we want to investigate, analyze, work on, dream about. And then we have friends of NAWI who come in and go out depending on what work we're doing. And we have a team of advisors as well who walk with us and guide and help sort of soundboard, but also provide their wisdom in guiding us through these sometimes treacherous waters that we exist in.
Yeah, I love that. Especially in a sort of era and space where, we think of competition between organizations and things like that. I mean, this has been a fundamental principle for me with Ijeruka is the importance of collective action and collaboration. And so I love the model that you have that distributes power, creativity, influence, the ability to actually contribute to the process to many different people. And fundamental in that is trust and recognizing all the different strengths and that no one organization or group of people can hold it alone. So really, really brilliant. I have two more questions for you. The first is looking ahead, what's your vision for NAWI for the next sort of 5 to 10 years? And then the last one is, what advice would you give to other professionals who want to start working in your field or maybe even start their own organization and they're aspiring to be as forward looking and disruptive as you are? What do you have any sort of tips for them or just anyone who's interested in entering into this, the economics policy space?
Okay, so now true to the politics that I have is I hope we stay small. I hope we move away from this push to constantly grow and growth as a thing that organizations have to aspire to. I hope we stay small. What I hope grows is the work. I hope we're able to seed, to encourage, to work alongside with a multiplicity of organizations, individuals, initiatives that are doing the work of world making, fighting for justice and liberation for this continent, for the women of this continent. So I hope that's what grows. As an institution, I hope we stay small. For people who are looking to either enter the work or seed work or start organizations, I think question what is, don't take anything as is and as truth with a capital T. Center what you want to change and who you want to work for and with. And lastly, everything is done in collective. I would never be able to do anything anywhere close to NAWI if I didn't have the associates and the entire collective of NAWI, but also all the women that have provided me wisdom on this journey. Theo Soa, former CEO of the African Women's Development Fund, Francoise Muduthe, who's current CEO of AWDF, Memory Kachambwa, director of Feminist, Eunice Kasimwe, Akinamama wa Africa. There's so many women who have been not just pivotal, but a constant shoulder. And also, all these people who are like, do you want to think about this a little bit more, but also hold on to your dreams. And I know that sounds so cliche, but be careful what you dream for, dream about and of, because most times it comes true with the right people around you. So stay true, stay authentic, always question and build what's authentically yours and what makes sense for you, despite what's going on around you.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, last one. Do you have any recommendations for resources, books, just anything that you feel that people really need to check out if they're trying to understand this field, specifically the macroeconomics and gender space, or if they are trying to understand, the space of building visionary organizations, of feminist possibilities, and things like that?
So on organizations, Hope Chikudu and Rudo Chikudu's book, it's a really small book and you can find it online for free. Building an Organization with a Soul, I think is a must read. Jessica Horn's book that's just come out is also on that list. One of my Bibles and go-tos is Sylvia Tamale's Decolonizing Afrofeminisms. That's a must read. Cheeky plug is In a Time Not So Far Away by NAWI, and that's a very hopeful read. When I'm feeling a little bit down, I always go to that, and it gives me a reminder of what we're fighting for and a world in which we're looking to go into. And then, so those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head, but NAWI curates a knowledge portal on our website that curates African women's thought leadership on economic questions, mostly African feminists, actually. And that has been such a joy to curate, but also have as a resource for people to be able to go back to. I mean, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks are wonderful and have been such a central part of knowledge for me to stand on. And at the same time, I think it's important as African feminists to reference, to build our knowledge on African feminist knowledge. And it's very political on whose knowledge you build your own knowledge. And so always curious to find who's writing, who's producing knowledge, who's creating. Nombuso Matibela, all her work on sonic cultural archival work is a must go to. And also recognizing that knowledge manifests in different ways. It can be written material, but it also can be like this, a podcast, a speech, music, an art installation. It could be many things. And opening up our curiosity to that, I think is also really important.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Crystal. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you and learning about your personal journey and the work that you're doing with NAWI and all the lessons that you shared. I'm going to continue to support you, and we will share NAWI's work in our newsletter, our Substack, as well as all of our platforms. Our next interview is actually with Francoise, who Crystal mentioned, so that's very exciting. So you'll get to hear about her work as well with the African Women's Development Fund. Thank you, Crystal, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. And for the space that you provide with Ejeruka, thank you for the opportunity, the space, and all the amazing work that you're doing with Ejeruka and the community that you're building.